Hey guys, a bit of a pre-show note to inform you of what's ahead. Today's guest is Josh Pawaar, a friend of mine and, as you will hear, a lucid thinker and speaker on a variety of issues. Josh's interests are multifaceted. He's interested in philosophical questions, existential and otherwise, political questions, and psychological ones. He's also studying psychoanalytic and psychosocial studies at the University of Essex at the moment. As such, on this occasion, Youssef and I focus more on getting Josh to share his ideas on how psychoanalysis frames his way of analyzing and viewing the world. We touch on various psychoanalytic concepts and definitions. We try to define every term as it comes up, but inevitably do a less than perfect job at times. In any case, the discussion was a thrill and covered quite a bit of ground. We discuss which questions should be the purview of modern psychoanalysis in the 21st century, how psychoanalysis can help us understand our modern circumstance, and questions such as how the internet becoming the most powerful engine for the proliferation of memes has made ancient adapted traits now maladaptive. As you will see, this fits into a larger discussion about suicide and what exactly suicide is, which Youssef and I kind of give a glimpse of here where we disagree. So if you're interested in our disagreement and interested in seeing a rare moment where Youssef and I have to hash things out in real time, this should be fairly fun. So with that said, I hope you enjoy the podcast, and if you want to get regular updates on the content we are producing, feel free to follow us on Instagram or Twitter, or like our page on Facebook. In general, if you want to support us further, become a patron on Patreon. That really helps us keep this going. Now, Experiments in Dialogue brings you a conversation with Josh Pawaar. Yeah, so we are here today with Josh Pawaar, a good friend of mine who I met at the University of Essex, someone who's studying psychoanalysis at the moment and who I've had many interesting discussions with. Yeah, so how are you, Josh?
Hello, Ahmed. I'm quite well, thank you, despite current world events. We met when you did a presentation at the Psychoanalysis Society, and I was quite impressed with your take on, well, it was fractal truths, wasn't it?
Thank you.
Within mathematics and by extension to evolutionary psychology and psychoanalysis. And I really did connect with it on an interested level. I was very interested because obviously you brought a lot of interesting ideas through. I don't mean to use the word interesting in a bland way, but I wasn't obviously an expert in what you were talking about at the time, and it's kind of bubbled away in my mind, as well as obviously my course material, which has been mind-blowing so far. I mean, I'm not really an academic per se. I'm only in the first year, though I have a lot of background in learning about psychoanalysis and philosophy, though the philosophical crowd tends to run rings around me on a regular basis because I'm not that familiar with the rhetoric, although I am becoming more familiar with it. So basically, I've taken an interest in what is relevant in general on the internet. I mean, the internet is kind of like the force these days, it seems. You know, as you spoke about, the evolution of ideas seems to develop at a rapid rate online, something that we've never really seen before, going from pen and paper to conferences, maybe seminars, as many of the famous psychoanalysts did, to rapid discussion online, for better or for worse, isn't it? Go on, sorry.
Just to come in here, because Youssef is my co-host, I'm sure you're aware by now, and really he's been the one who's more on the psychoanalysis side of things. And while we do interchange many ideas and we use each other to bounce back ideas and develop them, he was the one I really wanted to sit down with you and kind of talk. And so in general, let me just bring in Youssef and just ask him what his current view of psychoanalysis as it is so far. Like, where are the uses in his view, or what is it?
So hey, Josh.
Hey.
So I'm not as well versed as Ahmed has just made me seem to be, but I do have some interest when it comes to psychoanalysis, and I am understating by saying some, but I feel like the field of psychoanalysis has kind of trickled down to be this pseudoscientific, tarot card reading kind of archetypal imagery, we see around. But I am very interested mainly in Jungian archetypes and whatever evolved literature that came from it. So, hero mythology. I'm very interested in the underlying structures of and all that.
Let me just come in and frame this maybe in a kind of more question fashion to Josh, and you can bounce off of that however you want, Josh. And I just wanted to ask you really, so where do you come from? What is your intellectual background, and how exactly did you get into psychoanalysis and its sister fields? Let's say evolutionary psychology and psychology, for example. You've kind of already mentioned you're studying psychoanalysis at the moment. But how did you get interested in it? Why did it seem like something to go into, right? To devote 3 years to, right? So how come? Yeah.
So, alike many with a shallow understanding of psychoanalysis, and I obviously don't mean that in a derogatory way, we are ignorant of many things, obviously, just by default in the world. I thought, I have heard of Freud, I've heard of Jung, and they are, as Youssef said, somewhat portrayed as pseudoscientific figures. The way I approached academia, coming into an undergrad as a mature student, as I'm 28 now, was that I was interested in psychology, the function of the mind. They call it perhaps experimental psychology. But I was actually greeted very coldly by the faculty of psychology at Essex. I mean, I don't say that to say that it's representative of the whole department, but our discussions were anything but warm, and I felt that my interests in psychology were more applicable to perhaps society and politics and phenomena in a way. For example, the phenomena of smartphones, the phenomena of apps. Nobody can really deny that the internet, memes and so on, are really contributing to the development, for better or for worse, of young adults and teenagers. So my background very much is I'm a child of the environment of the internet, and I like to think that I'm quite worldly on a knowing basis. So knowing and understanding are not the same thing, right? So just like in the film Good Will Hunting, Matt Damon's character.
It's a great film.
Yeah,
excellent.
There.
Yeah. I mean, that was I don't mean to date the podcast,
no.
but I mean that's quite an old film.
That's good.
But,
that's good.
I really like metaphor, and Jung is quite strong into metaphor, obviously. But metaphor and idioms obviously have connotations that are often cultural. And, for example, I mean, the nature of in-jokes and memes, you need a basic level of understanding, otherwise it just doesn't mean anything.
May I press you just on that point?
Yeah, sure.
Just because when we say the term meme, sometimes Youssef and I use it more broadly. I'm sure you're aware of the more Dawkinsian definition of memes versus the meme that has become the word meme, right, on the internet. And I just want us to make maybe a distinction, because sometimes people are using meme, actually most times today, people are using meme in a way that it wasn't initially intended, but kind of has become its own thing, right? So people now see memes as these internet jokes, or I don't know how you would define it necessarily, but they're units of cultural information meant to evoke some sort of humor or ironic gesture, whereas the more original version of the definition, which was proposed by Richard Dawkins kind of as an analog to the term gene, a biological unit of information, the term meme was meant to evoke a definition that refers to cultural units of information more broadly. And so which version would you say that you grew up more with, or how is the term meme maybe fit in there? Go a bit into detail, okay. I guess, and is what I'm asking you to do.
Yeah, of course. So I believe that the common use of the word meme, i.e. perhaps a picture with some text on it, meant to evoke humour, I think that is, in a way, it's kind of a strange continuum, because I believe that, yes, when we say meme, we can mean a funny joke, an image that is shared, But I believe that it's becoming appropriate to weave that into the broader definition, because, I mean, at the end of The Selfish Gene, which was a very significant book that I read in my kind of intellectual development, Dawkins implies that the power of the meme is stronger than the gene, or can be, because, in terms of numbers and division, dividing your contribution to the gene pool by 50% each generation or more, perhaps, or less, I guess. In terms of sheer numbers and traits, as we kind of move into this diverse world, it seems that the traits we have are being homogenized anyway. So,
what do you mean by that? Just to be clear, what kind of traits are you thinking? Because I'm not too.
So, I mean, let's just say brown and blue eyes, for example.
Oh, you mean genetic traits?
We have.
Okay.
Yeah, of course, genetic traits. So, obviously, at face value, having blue or brown eyes doesn't have to contribute to anything. And I suppose the modern approach is that it doesn't necessarily contribute to anything, and it's more to do with ideas and ideology, isn't it?
The power of your character, right? That's something that we're more interested in now, right? That was the whole purpose of the civil rights movement in the U.S., for example, the evoking speech by Martin Luther King Jr., right, that many now forget. But I mean, go on. Sorry to interrupt there.
Yeah. So I mean, it's very right to kind of be granular with this. I think, I mean, just to kind of drop something in, analysis of memes is something that I'm looking into at the moment in terms of writing a lot of my papers. I actually wrote an analysis of the red pill phenomenon that we see, that's gone from The Matrix and originally Alice in Wonderland, arguably, to now recently Elon Musk's very kind of basic tweet, take the red pill, I believe it was, with the
choose the red pill.
And with Wachowski, one of the Wachowskis, throwing an expletive back at him, and also Ivanka Trump saying, how dare you misappropriate our meme in a way, but the memes seem to be appropriated, taken, misappropriated, and so on, in a chaotic kind of fashion, I guess, depending on the internet echo chamber or the Twitter echo chamber. Whichever.
This brings up kind of a point that I was wondering about your view on, and I think Youssef and I kind of have our own views, so it would be interesting to get yours. Do you think that the evolution of memes, that is the spread of memes, or the rate at which a given meme spreads, is determined by some sort of underlying structure? Is there some directionality to memetics, or is it purely random and chaotic, as you kind of mentioned? Do you think there is a directionality, a necessary directionality, perhaps dictated by underlying genes, or a pre-grammar, as Chomsky would put it, for language, but perhaps for memes instead?
It's difficult to say. There are so many factors at play, because, of course, a meme... I mean, from classic image board culture, memes generally, I believe that virality, things going viral, it's very seemingly random. Things can go viral that you really think there's really nothing special about that, but the way that things gather steam and so on, it's far more chaotic than, say, a gene, a literal gene that makes you tall because you can pick more fruit from the tree. And obviously there's mainstream media, there's kind of, the social medias, there's the fringe communities and so on. And I think, to kind of bring psychoanalysis in, if I may, for a moment, humor is broader than laughter these days, I find. For example, Dave Chappelle just released a comedy special in a socially distant manner, and it was anything but comedy. It was him talking the truth, or his perceived truth, among, perhaps people who agree with him or not. I know he can be quite incendiary, kind of polemic in a way. But it seems that humour is key in the spreading of memes. And humour, I mean, to kind of bring it back again, in-jokes, obviously every kind of community has these little in-jokes, I find, whether it's work, family, academic environments, that seem to run on on because it's a common ground. And I believe, I don't know if this is my original idea, maybe I need to read a bit more on the subject, but just the idea that humour is found where there is unconscious similarity. So, for example, if we're both thinking the same thing, but in a politically correct environment or an environment with set social rules, we cannot necessarily say it. When somebody says something that you agree with, it can bring a release, like a relief of kind of pent up, the psychic energy, as Freud would call it, libido. And that libido can be expressed in laughter, it feels good, and so on. And likewise with memes online or in-jokes in a group, it can bring this relief of, after all, I'm more similar to you than I thought, perhaps. My condemnable idea that I had is not so condemnable and can be expressed in the same way that perhaps we see pride in the LGBTQ. Obviously, that's like a release of being oneself and one's ideas. And that, I think, spreads the meme side.
No, I kind of think that your points on memes and relating it back to psychoanalysis is very interesting. But just kind of to bring it back as well, both fields, actually, both memetics and psychoanalysis, have been disparaged in circles and have been seen as pseudoscience. And I was just wondering, really, just to press you a bit, what exactly do you think psychoanalytic ideas and memetics and these ideas that are commonly castigated for being pseudoscientific, not really objective, what do you think they have to offer us, right? What is the value of these things?
If I can come in here, just for our listeners, if you can give us some form of nuanced definition to what psychoanalysis actually is, and what's the difference between psychoanalysis and other, let's say, psychology disciplines?
So, in approximately the year 1900s, Sigmund Freud began to come into his own when it came to, I'll be honest, he wanted to gain acclaim. Okay, so, and I think a psychoanalysis that he gave birth to in a way, arguably, as he kind of drew on ideas from Nietzsche and Plato, he brought together. So psychoanalysis is this bringing together of almost the human condition. It was, in my opinion, a hopelessly ambitious idea by Sigmund Freud, but as you may know, and as the listeners may know, he was very egocentric. He was ruthless academically. And psychoanalysis is basically, the metaphor that I was given in my learning was the black box of the human mind. Psychology looks at behaviors and how what we can see and what we can measure can be indicative of what's within the head, within the mind, within the space, within the psyche. But Sigmund Freud aimed to, in his preliminary attempts, find what really made us tick. The problem with psychoanalysis and the blessing of psychoanalysis is that it seeks to find what really bothers an individual. For example, the infamous immortal Oedipus complex. The idea that one will always desire their own mother, right, is a very, very, it punches someone and really says, wow, that's really kind of revolting, the idea that you can desire one's mother. But the fact that you find that revolting suggests that it has some significance. Now, I would not necessarily go so far as to say if something makes you angry, then it's something that you're insecure about, because I know that people say in arguments that when you get mad, it means that the other person's right. So it's not quite that. But psychoanalysis, it is the barrier to objectivity between the human mind and objectivity, where science seeks to make everything numbers, measurable, everything, I mean, I would say homogeneous, but not really homogeneous. So, for example, if you have two apples, you could say I have one apple and one apple, and you're homogenizing them into one concept, an apple, right? But that's psychology, right? So the idea that you can make things the same by measuring them in a quantitative manner, right? Psychoanalysis is this qualitative, what they call idiosyncratic, which is individual, all the things that contribute to an individual being individual. individual, the innumerable factors that can make an individual, Freud said, okay, look, we cannot look at this on a very zoomed in level. I believe it was called biophysics when he began, of all these factors coming together. He kind of zoomed out to a macro level and said, okay, look, this is difficult to measure, so we're going to look at things on a macro level, and it's difficult to we don't have time to analyze an apple and an apple. We're just going to say it's apples, right? But he kind of he seeked to dive in and say, look, everybody's different, right? And all these factors, we're going to try and make some really sweeping claims, right? Because we don't have the time to look at each neuron in the brain, and they couldn't obviously at that time. But it's subjectivity of the human
so
condition.
Psychoanalysis for you comes in to allow us to elaborate on what it is to be human in a kind of phenomenological perspective in a way. It's a reflection on human existence in general. Is that kind of where it lies, you would say?
Yeah. Essentially, yeah. I mean, Freud looked at what he called, what they called hysteria, which was the physical manifestation of mental pathology. So, for example, if somebody was in a real state, they had a paralysis of their arm, but they couldn't find a biological cause. Psychoanalysis was born out of a clinical approach.
Is there a phantom limbs phenomena? Is that similar to that? I'm not sure.
Perhaps. I mean, it's difficult to say, and I kind of had a little bit of back and forth with my lecturer, who was excellent in this regard, because obviously their ability to measure biological causes of physical symptoms at that point was not as developed as it is now, that we're starting to, we've got fMRI scans, we've got all kinds of scans to look at brain activity and so on. Back then, they really were dealing with a primitive toolkit, a relatively primitive toolkit. And it was born out of a desire to fix, quote unquote, fix people. Well, it's not a quote from there, but neuroses were a big problem after the industrial revolution and industrialization of Europe. So it's difficult to okay, so let me kind of go back to a question that I was given in one of my first seminars, which was, what is psychoanalysis? And it's kind of, to answer that question is to say, what is life? It's a very broad concept, and obviously it's gone to politics, culture, society, sociology. It's really branched off in so many directions. It's beautiful, but at the same time, I don't really have the license to say what it is today. I feel like I'm clutching at straws every time I try and kind of define it.
Perhaps it is less about the particular contents or set of beliefs that are encoded within modern-day psychoanalytic literature, and more about a particular method or way of investigating things. I know when I think of science, I don't necessarily think of science as a body of facts, although it is partially that. I think of it more predominantly as kind of a method of approaching things algorithmically, married to some creative element of the human psyche to facilitate a better understanding of the universe and a better understanding of our current circumstance. And the point of science is really as that method. Now, it isn't necessarily always as perfectly systematic and algorithmic as we'd like it to be. Science can be messy. But in general, science is the most rigorous way we have of analyzing and attempting to abstract from the specific instances we are observing. Right? It's using observation and coupling it with measurement and really rigorous standards in order to attain something like a knowledge of the whole or the general. Right? And so maybe psychoanalysis is kind of analogous to that in the sense that it is a method or a philosophy of approaching certain problems. Would you think that's a fair thing to say?
I mean, I do have a question. I do have a question pertaining that. So, you mentioned where psychoanalysis has gone wrong, or where Freud and Jung and such were kind of being way too hopeful, I think he said, with their approach. So my question is not rather what is the positive definition of psychoanalysis. But where do you think psychoanalysis has its place in the academic field, in the in literature in general? Where do you think it should actually, let's see, be utilized?
So this is a difficult one for me, because initially, coming in from a scientific, I mean, I came from human biology to psychology, and then through what Jung would call synchronicity, which is a meaningful coincidence, I found my way to psychoanalysis. So initially, I thought that, so the clinical method is obviously the one that Freud started with and Jung started with but moved on from. But I've also found value within the analysis of media, so the psychoanalysis of film, literature, TV. But it's not obviously the same, because we are degrees of separation away. So, for example, I'll just use one example. So with Jung, he developed personality types, which have now been taken by big business and used as the Myers-Briggs personality test. Right, so Jung initially used this to find out the weak areas of the human psyche, because he believed in balance in the psyche. And this is the key idea from Jung. The idea of a balance in the psyche is how we reach what he called individuation, which is to be one's true self, free of the trappings of what life has put upon the individual. So this has been taken into the Myers-Briggs personality test and is now used to develop strengths, which is the complete antithesis of the original use. Absolutely, and now people are becoming more and more encouraged to work on their strengths. And although on paper it looks good, you want somebody who can sell as many cars as possible. When they go home, I mean, I wouldn't say that they're dysfunctional, but they're more likely to be dysfunctional if they're unbalanced, right? So to me, like, the clinical psychoanalysis should stay clinical. And that is seen, for example, in the UK, in psychotherapy, counselling, the BACP, British, I believe it's the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. That's strong. And that should stay there, right? But the analysis of film, TV, it can reflect the psyche of the masses, but it must be applied properly. So, for example, obviously a work of fiction is a reflection of the mind of the author, which is a reflection of the sign of the times, potentially. Right? So context is always really important. So, I mean, context being dropped and omission, the power of omission is immense, right? So you could have two people strike each other literally in combat, but if you focus on the fact that one person struck the other and omit that it was in retaliation, then all of a sudden we have a monster on our hands, right? It must be used responsibly. So I mean, for example, what I said about the red pill, this has kind of been taken online as a form of self-psychoanalysis, right? Take the red pill. What exactly does that mean? Okay, so Freud himself would say you cannot psychoanalyze yourself. I think any psychoanalyst.
That's like, well, what did he say? Didn't Alan Watts say something about that?
Yeah, which part of Alan Watts?
I think it was trying to explain yourself or trying to psychoanalyze yourself. It's like biting your own teeth.
Yes, of course.
Something.
Something. I mean,
I was just watching him.
Yeah, Josh is a big fan of Alan Watts, to my understanding, right? I mean, maybe not fan, but
I am too.
Consumer of material, right?
Yes, I mean, I identify with Alan Watts because he doesn't. He's not. I don't think he's an academic. He has lived it. He was an Episcopal, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, priest, Protestant priest. Went to the Far East and studied Zen Buddhism, but he's brought it back with a touch of reality. And the fact that Zen Buddhism itself is not meant to be taken too seriously, another Alan Wattsism, if you will allow it, is the problem with life is that humans take seriously what God intended to be a joke, which with all the vitriol, the hatred, my perceived hatred flying around in the media, social medias, and so on, I really do find solace in Alan Watts's ideas. Though within psychoanalysis, he touches on Freud and Jung, but it's difficult to weave in because I'm not sure he's been kind of given a podium within academic circles. He's very endearing. I definitely recommend. I've just listened to Out of Your Mind, which is a collection from his archive, and it was very. The last lecture was about coming to terms with death and so on, and the idea that religion would help us come to terms with death, but now we've kind of thrown it away in favour of science, but you can't hug science, right? The doctor will try and keep you alive, but the priest is saying, if you do die, it's all good, you're going up to our Father in heaven, right? And maybe you don't believe in a Father in heaven, but the solace you have on your deathbed is kind of important, I feel.
Yeah. I mean, just to come in here, I was wondering maybe something a bit tangential to that. How exactly, in light of your psychoanalytic toolkit, do you see our current moment, our current world, particularly from a historical perspective, and what is novel about today's circumstance? I mean, this is something that we are always discussing on this podcast and interested in. How do we observe our current world through a lens that is perhaps, in your case, psychoanalytical, or a lens in general that is different and helpful?
It's a difficult time. I believe the rate of change is exponential, especially with the advent of the internet. One particular problem that I see within psychoanalysis, and this is relevant to the Oedipus complex, this is something that I may study a lot further, is that people are very quick, in some instances, to undermine the actions of our fathers, mothers sometimes, and ancestors. People want to believe that we are a further evolved human being, which is objectively not true. We are still Homo sapiens, right? And we are climbing this, this is used in political context, but this greasy pole of trying to become an advanced, enlightened race, like in Star Trek, for example.
So would you ascribe the phenomenon of people undermining their ancestors' achievements predominantly to the fact that they believe they are a more evolved, more intelligent, more capable versions of what came before them?
So basically, yes. As an anecdotal example, if I worry about something that I've done in the past, so for example, I feel like I've said something that was wrong, I wish I could go back and redo something, I'm basically undermining who I was in the past, saying that guy was a fool, and what he did doesn't make any sense, as if I know better now, right? And that is a problem, because a lot of the things, for example, within conservatism, they have trust in what came before because we're still here, right? In terms of kind of light evolution, like social evolution, it's kind of like this is a very hot topic. The conservatives in the UK and America, Christians believe, for example, that marriage should be between a man and a woman because that's what's in the scripture and the teachings of what they believe in, and they also believe that the family unit should be strong. But now we're kind of seeing people challenge this and say, my own personal belief is that yes, we can have a union between people of the same biological sex, right? But the family unit is breaking down, it seems, right? So mother, father, children, that's being challenged, right? So we're seeing challenging of old ways and people saying this is fine. This is fine. We're moving forward. This is fine. We don't need that necessarily. And it's like, okay, well, are you sure about that? And if you say, are you sure about that? You're some sort of far right person.
The reason I ask you whether you believe that's the case or not is because, well, here's what I believe, right? I believe that people undermine their ancestors' achievements because, well, I think it stems from a lack of controlled suffering, let's call it, but it kind of results in this phenomenon in which people go, things are very safe right now. And there shouldn't be a reason why people that look different than me should be suffering. It's this kind of ignorance of relative, history. It's this kind of ignorance. But then you add this very good point, right? Because on top of that, they don't only just think that, and then they think, well, even though I believe that it must have always been this easy to live and this safe, we're even more evolved and more capable, and therefore we have no excuse for the world to be as bad as it is right now. And that kind of, and then the progressive spirit comes in, and it's just, let's destroy everything and build it anew. So I do like the concept.
Let me try and come in here and steelman the case of those who are particularly progressive and perhaps even naively progressive in our eyes, because what I think they are trying to get at, and I think Youssef and I are a lot more sympathetic with it when we are talking about our own context and our own country, is I think that the progressive plight is to come to the world and, yes, as you said, Youssef, to observe the vast discrepancies and disparities between individuals who are merely lucky and individuals who are merely unlucky, and to see the value of moral luck, right? The value that moral luck plays in the degree to which you are able to live out a life that is in line with flourishing, or the value of moral luck in preventing people from being able to live good lives, is something appalling, right? It is something that, Rawls, to go back to John Rawls, who's a great political philosopher, published a book called Our Theory of Justice, and his entire idea of the veil of ignorance, right, which is a thought experiment, was to explain to us why we should be progressives, essentially. It is a very reasonable argument for why every person should be progressive to some degree. And the argument goes like this. It is, imagine you are about to be born and you have no idea, no preconception of what kind of particular role you are going to end up with on the die, right? So you have no idea whether you're going to be born in Palestine, right, under an occupation, or whether you're going to be born in Syria or whatever, right? You have no idea, right? Or if you're going to be born a billionaire, for that matter. And imagine now that we put a veil of ignorance on you. This is what it's called, right? And we ask you to propose the kind of world that you would like to be born into. The answer that every individual will get upon pondering this particular experiment for maybe a few seconds is that we need to build a world where the roll of the die doesn't actually make that much of a difference, right? Where moral luck is not such a difficult thing to reconcile with your desire to live out your life and think, okay, well, I'm lucky, I'm fine, I'm just going to live out my life. No, it's just hard to come into this world and see the degree to which luck still plays a role. And we might pat ourselves on the back and say, okay, well, we've made a lot of progress, but what progress have we made if luck plays such an immense role? And this is just a steelman, really, the argument, and the part of the argument that perhaps even resonates to some degree with me. And I just wonder, are we being a bit too dismissive, perhaps, of this line of argumentation, just to be fair to this argument? Josh, Youssef, either of you really can answer that.
So, you're right. The infamous Jordan B. Peterson may say, outcome, what is it, equality of outcome, right? So the roll of the dice, it shouldn't be a dice, right? We are risk averse as humans. I believe that's fairly well proven. And I think there's a strange thing with empathy. Within psychoanalytic circles, probably the wrong ones, people talk about empaths, right? Empaths who they suffer because other people are suffering, so please don't suffer because your suffering makes me suffer. Right, and this is kind of a cynical take. When people see suffering in the world, you have to ask yourself, are they trying to solve this because they truly care for the other person, or is it because they have a narcissistic kind of intention to become a good person? So if we change this roll of the dice, okay, so it becomes much more level playing field to even out the game of life, the method is important, right? So if we have equality of outcome, we shouldn't have difference in equality of opportunity. I mean, I've been flying all over the place with recent events, and equality of outcome and equality of opportunity can never be the same because there are slight differences. I mean, one of the firestorms of discussion is between men and women in science. For example, men gravitate more towards science. So if you make more opportunities for women to go into science, you would naturally have to, take opportunities away from men. And you may have...
Toward physics and chemistry, definitely. Like biology tend to be also not dominated by men. And then also applied sciences. I mean, if we're talking medicine is almost dominated by women. So, well, it even depends on what kind of medicine.
Yeah. So, I mean, the mature mindset is to say that there are, obviously this is not about, say, war-torn areas that surely do not deserve civilians to live in those areas, but in Western environments, quality.
So the case, I guess, for equality of opportunity has kind of already been made to some degree and extended in the West to possibly its logical conclusion. Now we know where we want to be in the West, right? And we're working towards that. That would be maybe the argument that would respond to my concerns in the West, at least, right? So we've already made some strides in opening up opportunities, and perhaps equality of outcome is something that, I mean, I for one am not in favor of equality of outcome. That wasn't where I was going with the roll of the die experiment. For me, it's think about it think about a person's success or flourishing.
Maybe.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Maybe equal access to equal opportunity.
Yeah, I was gonna
rather than equality of outcome.
Yeah, what I was gonna say is essentially, if you think of a person's success or flourishing, even ethically, as a multivariate or a multi-factor issue, then you can ask yourself what proportion of the variation in each of these things, right? So flourishing and success, what proportion of these different things that we value are determined by luck, right? And it seems to me that definitely in the West, we have attempted to reduce the proportion, right? More now in the West is up to individual capacities, individual hard work. But it is also the case that so much of what accounts for success and what accounts for flourishing is actually up to luck, even in the West, especially if you are born in certain communities or in certain backgrounds. And this is something that concerns me, and I'm sure concerns even you guys. But I mean, go on. What do you think of that?
Well, I was just going to say, because you spoke about, I believe was it the loneliness of subjectivity in the previous episode, and to kind of circle back to psychoanalysis, I suppose it aims to, I don't want to say quantify the subjectivity, because I think the problem with subjectivity is, as you know, it's so multifactorial. In development, psychoanalysis is very important in development of people, the psyche as they grow up. That we can use psychoanalysis to understand, perhaps, kind of give meaning, and because psychoanalysis can be applied empirically, because you say luck, and I think luck is a fine word to use. I would say chaos as well.
I just use luck. I mean, I use the term moral luck specifically because that's the term that many moral philosophers would use. Moral luck is just basically what we refer to as just the luck of the draw, really, in life, right? More broadly. Yeah, so that's why I use that term. But yeah, chaos, randomness, definitely. Yeah. But it happens to be in favor or against whoever. I mean,
right? Luck just happens to be like a byproduct of chaos. Like chaos seems to be more general, more overshadowing.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the battles we see today is people are trying to determine what luck is. For example, you're lucky if you're a white male, or you're lucky if you live in the West, or so on. That's a big, for example, privilege is almost like an original sin, right? Because although potentially there is a benefit to be found being born, I mean, for example, let's take, let's just say India, right? Booming population. It has, its own problems, right? But I'm sure that there's plenty of very, very happy people in India. But in general, I think people would say that if you want to have, quote unquote, the good life, as some social media influencers would say, then you want to be born into a country that is higher up in the global economic hierarchy, right? But there was French sociologist who wrote about suicide, Emile Durkheim, right? He spoke about how, the more industrious, the more economically developed a country becomes, the higher the rate of suicide. So now it's a difficult discussion to have, because if we have a higher rate of suicide, which is potentially the most dysfunctional act a human can commit,
dysfunctional in the sense that, I mean,
to his individual, let's say.
Individual, sure. I mean, obviously, there is value. I mean, I'm dealing with this with.
I'm pretty sure being a genocidal maniac is worse than committing suicide. Yeah, it's more dysfunctional.
I mean, Yeah. So, I mean, the problem is, it's a very common thing for people to say, I wish the ground would swallow me up, or, I was so embarrassed I could die, right? It's this weird kind of button in our brain. And I believe if you perceive your value to be low socially, then perhaps it does make sense for you to remove yourself from the gene pool.
This is where people are going to be listening to us with pikes and forks ready. So let me just come in here to be, maybe, I don't know, I'll try and make things clear. If it's not as clear as you want it to be, sure, but this is my understanding. The case you are making is that the reason why we see suicide as a common feature, at least common enough in human society and across human history, must be because it served some adaptive benefit at some period of time. That is, maybe you increase the likelihood of the rest of your family being able to reproduce and perpetuate itself by you killing yourself, because perhaps you were some sort of hindrance, right? Maybe you were really unable to help, and they were having to devote so many resources to you that kind of we have now this button in our minds, which is facilitated by our genes, just in case the genes end up in the wrong host, right? To switch us off and kind of tell us to kill ourselves. Now, just because this was historically or evolutionarily potentially how things unfolded, just because we happen to have this module in our brains does not mean that it is that we are defending this in any way, right? Does not mean we are saying this is a good thing, right? On the contrary, I think the reason why you said it was so dysfunctional at the beginning was especially to clarify that you find it something that is really sad and tragic.
I'm not really willing to take that analysis to be true. Honestly,
what analysis?
When it comes of suicide,
what analysis?
Maybe we'll come to this agreement here. The analysis that the reason suicide has come to exist so far until this moment is because it must have had some adaptive benefit at one point in history.
Yeah, I absolutely believe this. Really, not absolutely, but yeah, to some degree of certainty.
I don't believe. I think there is some. I don't know. Like, I haven't thought this through, but I do have an idea of. Well, I believe maybe it's kind of a product of our self-awareness and this lag or miscommunication between our consciousness and, well, to put it vaguely, and our own biological self. It's kind of a miscommunication between our replicators and whatever higher brain function is at play here. I don't believe it's I don't know,
an evolutionary product.
It is an evolutionary product, but not in this, not in the classic sense.
You don't think it's adaptive? It's been adaptive at any point.
I don't think that no suicide can be adaptive.
You think suicide in general could not possibly be adaptive?
No, I do not believe that. I believe that some suicides could be adaptive, but I don't believe in general, the idea that people have committed suicide throughout the ages has been because it is evolutionary.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying the fact that the buttons for suicide are there to be found and there to be even evoked by the particular environment we happen to be in. The fact that that is the case, the fact that nature has not simply sealed that off, and I think it would be fairly easy to seal that off. I don't imagine it would be particularly difficult. I think that the reason why it hasn't been sealed off must have been because it was adaptive at a certain point. I mean, think about the fact that you are looking at an organism not as an individual, but from the gene's eye view. Of course, there are going to be circumstances where it is actually a valid thing to do. Now, I'm not saying that in our current instance, people's perception that they are worthless to the rest of their families, or even in the past 200, 300, even 1,000 years, I'm not saying that just because you feel that, it means it is objectively true, but you must have some faculties able to pick up at whether you are being valuable or not. Your feelings of being suicidal, being worthless, or even being a hindrance to the rest of your family or your population or lineage must correlate more than randomly with whether you actually are. And I think that's not an audacious thing to say, right? All it needs to be is just 50%.
It's not. So yeah, it's not.
But I agree with you.
No, so it's more like the faculty, our status faculties.
The
ones that determine our. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Sorry, Josh. We this
this
is one of the rare moments where Youssef and I actually disagree on the podcast.
Well, sorry about that.
We needed to hash it out here.
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. I apologize if it came across as maybe insensitive. No. But my only intention was to say that I will kind of take a lateral viewpoint which is many things in modern life seem to be taken to the extreme. I believe you're talking about sugar on the last episode, for example. Refined sugar. I mean, obviously, not obviously, but it comes from sugar cane, which is packaged with a lot of fiber and is, I believe, nutritious to some extent, right? So we've taken the sweet part and we've made it its own thing. And I'll just chime in again. Freud, for example, was a big proponent of cocaine as anesthetic /
as many are.
Agent for opiate withdrawal, because that was being. He was in an age where opiates were being used, around surgeries and pain, right? So. He began as a proponent of this cocaine, and it's been a scandal. People say, he liked a bit of the old, snuff or whatever. Not snuff, but cocaine, It's become a bit of a problem because people kind of, it's a cop-out. People say, Freud, he liked the cocaine. But anyway, my point is, it's been taken to an extreme, and you could say that with suicide, potentially, the symptoms of anxiety, depression, and so on can become extreme because of modern life, right?
Yes, the mismatch.
Right. I mean, I believe.
No, absolutely.
My own opinion is that if you have disease or you've committed some sort of heinous act, it would be beneficial to go and reflect away from everybody else, which is typical depressive behaviour. You don't really want to socialise. You withdraw, and you're probably not in a state to fight, hunt, gather. You may be contagious, so it's a good idea to withdraw. But obviously, in modern life. This ability to withdraw is almost impossible. Arguably, because we have smartphones, for example. People may numb, the processing process. For example, if you did something stupid, said something stupid, and you feel it really drag you down. I think rarely do people these days have the low stimuli environments to go and reflect and sit with their feelings, right? This is very common in counselling. They say, we're trying to get people to sit with their feelings more often instead of just distract, and as Freud would say, repress and repress. Right. I mean, another kind of sensitive topic is bereavement, obviously. One of the worst things that can happen to somebody is to lose somebody precious. Yeah. And the time afterwards is, it's going to be horrible. You're going to have anhedonia, which is, loss of pleasure from everything in life. Yeah. And as a result, if people are too dependent on their creature comforts, on their food, on their devices, addictive material, and they don't work anymore, then people can really kind of reach a really, really dark place where they question why they're hanging around. And Albert Camus, for example, one of his philosophical
making great
questions,
references again. Josh,
yeah, of course.
Josh, this is really good.
Citation machine, right? What is it? Google buzzwords or whatever. One of his questions that Alan Watts touched on too was, why wouldn't you commit suicide, right? So it's a very odd thing to say for most people. Why wouldn't you do that? Well, because it's it's forbidden in religion. It's horrible. It's going to cause a lot of damage to your family and shame potentially. And it's very difficult to talk about. It touches on something very kind of raw.
Yeah.
But I mean, sorry, if I can just kind of circle around, like in the West, like why is this becoming like prevalent?
Yes.
I mean, we could say that it's measured more, sure. But this luck, being born into this. Let's say you're a white male and you have this white male privilege, and yet you somehow become an abject failure. Surely that's going to hurt more and more as people kind of tell you. I mean, I had quite a grisly discussion with somebody about this recently. I won't go into details, but it was somebody with this perceived privilege and luck who was in a bad spot, and somebody had the gall to say, but it would be worse if you were a minority here and there and the next thing. And it's like, okay, but we can't compare these things, right? Psychoanalysis would say, why would you compare one person suffering to another? Because we're all individuals, right? We have this subjectivity, and it's lonely, like as you said. Yes. Perhaps I hope I'm using that correctly.
No, you're very right. Yeah, go on, please.
And I mean, psychoanalysis, like this subjectivity, like Jung, for example, he would sit face to face with people, and if he didn't understand, he would say, "That's on me." Right? This isn't a broken person who's on the verge of suicide or whatever. This is I need to work on this, right?
Yeah, but even if they are, right, that still doesn't mean that they are hopeless, right? Like, I mean, even if a person has all these kinds of problems, I mean, you need to spend time and try to understand them, and we're not going to always understand each other perfectly. This is exactly the point of the loneliness of subjectivity and the point marshaled by people who play the identity politics card. But just to go back, one thing that you touched on, and Youssef and I touched on when we were having that brawl, it was the fact that our current circumstance is so novel and is potentially so different. Remember, I think we invoked in the previous episode the environment of evolutionary adaptation, and we distinguished it from the environment of evolutionary novelty. And I didn't end up explaining what the environment of evolutionary novelty was specifically in the past episode. But the point is that it's exactly this environment that is so it's the thing that we all know, and it is so saturated with social media, with advertisements trying to capture your attentional resources, and it is the environment that we are living in at the moment. And the mismatch between this environment and the environment of our ancestors, just to go back to how little we appreciate our ancestors, we also underappreciate the degree to which our environment is so different from our ancestors, right? We take it for granted. And we assume that these old ancient faculties, right, that were probably all tuned up and gotten in place around 300,000 years ago, potentially changed for a bit after that, but not in any drastic measure, right? These faculties we have are going to fare just as well in our current environment as they did in the past environment for which they were evolved, right? It is absolutely not plausible that be the case, simply because the environment we live in is just so different. It is so different, right? No one could even imagine it. I mean, there's this quote by Isaac Asimov where he goes that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And fact is, if you were to take the technologies that we have today and travel back in time and give it to someone 6,000 years ago, right? Just 6,000 years ago, that's nothing in evolutionary time, right? If you even go 300 years ago, the person would assume that you were giving them some magical instrument or that you were some sort of sorcerer, right? And The fact that that's the case is probably the reason why all these faculties that otherwise were evolved for very particular scenarios, right? The fact that we were evolved to seek out sugar because, it's something that you're likely not going to encounter very often, especially if you're nomadic, you haven't settled down and lived in a civilization, right? The fact that that was our ancient circumstance means that today, in a world saturated with refined sugar, again, to use that point because it's such a non-controversial one, the fact that that's the case is liable to just bring people into discalibration, right? People are going to be discombobulated by the fact that all these different advertisers are trying to get them to consume this sugar, and they will do it because it's tapping into an ancient mechanism. And the same applies potentially with this suicide discussion. The fact is that today, probably whatever faculties we had that captured to some degree reality of us being potentially useless to our lineage, that faculty is being overstimulated, right? And now what you have is people who are feeling they are useless and worthless because they are looking at social media and seeing Dan Bilzerian, right? And feeling like absolute losers, right? So, but that would have never been the case, right? I mean, even Genghis Khan was not Dan Bilzerian, right? Because Genghis Khan, he was still having to share the women, at least that he wasn't attracted to, with the rest of his platoon, right?
He only impregnated like half of it.
Yeah, I mean, like it's just not,
Oh my gosh, so true.
Yeah, so it's just you're constantly feeling like, oh, how am I ever going to compete? But that wasn't what you were supposed to compete with ever, and it potentially still isn't, right? Is that really what you should be competing? But now you are interfacing with the reality of everyone around you, and this is something to go back to Youssef's point in the past podcast, right? Multiculturalism and globalization has had immense benefits and beautiful benefits, right? I'm a xenophile. I love things that are different. I love exploring them, right? But that does not mean that everything that's come from globalization was good, right? Yeah, and it doesn't mean that I am going to necessarily be in favor of something like the fact that we are constantly in tune with different circumstances from our own, right? So if I'm in Syria, my life is being ravaged, I potentially could still have access to the internet. That's still possible. And if I have access to the internet, I go on Instagram, right? Like, what a stark difference that is, right? Maybe the person who is living the best in my particular community isn't actually doing much better than I am, right? Because my community is ravaged. But because I can tap into someone who's living in, I don't know, Florida or just not to minimize their struggles, but they're a different kind of struggle, one that potentially is more subtle, and that I, as someone in Syria who's struggling with things that are more immediate, more crucial, more physical, more biological than mental, would be liable to just be completely overwhelmed by, right? And this is something I think that people are not as attuned to today. So yeah, I agree with you. We're being overstimulated in many ways, and suicide is just another one of them. We're being overstimulated.
Yeah, I mean, if lobsters, Jordan Peterson's lobsters, for goodness sake. So, I mean, a lot of people attack his lobsters point. The social hierarchy of lobsters, and they say, "Oh, lobsters though." But I think it's a very interesting case study, assuming it is legitimate.
Yeah.
The idea that if your perceived social ranking is not adequate. And one of the things in psychoanalysis is this concept of superego, something that an ego ideal, which basically means that what you shouldn't do is the superego says what you shouldn't do, and by default, kind of leaves you in no man's land, thinking, how do I fulfill my needs? And obviously, social media is going to maybe fulfill an ego ideal role.
Can you just for a second explain maybe the ego, the id, the superego, and then the ego ideal as conceptualized? Just be very clear on the definitions.
Sure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
This will be helpful.
So id, ego, and superego are the three. They are areas and mechanisms within the psyche. So they do things. Freud defined them in the ego and the id, and basically the id is the very primal, basic pool, if you like, of ideas, thoughts, desires, drives, as he said, drives to fulfill your needs.
Yeah.
And you could say that they're biological, something as simple as, thirst, hunger, the need for sex as well, quite biological.
The reptilian brain, so to speak, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Otherwise called.
Reptilian. Yeah, exactly. Reptilian brain isn't referenced as much in psychoanalysis, but essentially, yes.
It's kind of the analog, though, which is interesting, right? That this is something that's been carried into psychology.
Yeah, I guess so. I do believe that there is more in common between psychology and psychoanalysis than perhaps the critics might be in either field, but essentially the id is the reptilian brain that potentially, if left unchecked, could lead to a lot of destruction in the world.
But it's necessary as well, right? Absolutely necessary. That's
sure.
the double-edged sword. Yeah.
This is. Stop me at any point because this is very complicated. But as we were talking about multiculturalism, and it kind of brought to me the idea of self and other, right? So perceived self and other. So you can either identify with somebody else or something, which makes them less of another, or you may be xenophobic, as an example of saying the other is an enemy, bad, right? So as we develop, Freud's basic theory was that when we start as an infant, we are tyrannical, we are narcissistic, because we're terrified. We've been born into this world where, hunger, we've just come from a nirvana-like state in the womb where all of our desires, our needs are taken care of automatically, and we have to fight tooth and nail. We have to cry, we need to really show that we're hungry, that we need to go to the toilet or whatever, right? So the idea is that as we mature, we form an ego and a super ego. So ego is like who you think you are. It's kind of like the conscious mind. And there's this continuum that's painted between id and super ego. So the Oedipus complex, which is about aforementioned mother. What it's really about, in my understanding, is the understanding that you are not the center of the universe, right? Your tyrannical narcissism has to reach a point where you cannot express it, otherwise you will come under attack, right? And the first perceived enemy is the father, right? Because you're fighting for the affection of the mother with this other, right? This father. You realise that. A metaphor that was used by my lecturer was, you have to understand basic things like, you are not the universe, right? You're born and you are an object in the world. You're a person in the world. You are different from the table. If somebody destroys the table, it has no real effect on you, right? Yeah. You broaden your perspective, right? And you start with you and then yourself and your mother, and then you realize there's a father, maybe siblings. And the process of maturation is one of realizing that the world is more and more complicated as you go.
Definitely.
So...
Yeah. That's a recent realization that I've had, actually, in it. I was kind of reflecting at how I used to be far more confident. A lot of people would argue that I'm very confident these days, but I used to be so much more confident in my ideas and so much less attuned, perhaps, to the nuance and complexity of the world. And to some degree, I think it's part of the important role of children and the inquisitive child archetype. To reference an idea by Jung, right? An archetype being potentially a pattern of behavior or ideas that is perpetuated across time and is kind of fundamental in a way to human cognition, human activity, right? I would even argue to nature if we're taking it to biology. But for me, the child archetype is kind of one of being able to cut through the overcomplications of the adult world, which comes at a fault of also undercomplicating things which are actually complex, right? It is at once the ability to reduce and to be unconvinced by the adult's world, right? And to be able to see more clearly through the messiness of it, but also to be unable to see the true complexity where it actually is. And this is something that plays a very important fundamental role in society, I think, right? And a lot of times adults are tired of children because they are saying, you don't get it, you're too young to understand, right? And sometimes that's true, but a lot of other times, adults really do make things overcomplicated. Sometimes a chair is just a chair, right? Sometimes you don't need to be talking about the chair's particles or anything like that, and it's just the child's role is to reawaken that, right? The ability to see things in brute form to some degree. Sorry, I don't know how that fits in, but yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, two things. I mean, Occam's razor comes to mind, right? The idea to simplify things without hopefully becoming too like fundamental, like driven or fundamentalist. And also, there's a quote I came across, a poet, Wordsworth perhaps. The child is the father of the man, right? Because the child comes first. And people tend to forget this, as you say, being inquisitive. And, I remember when I was younger thinking to myself, why are all these people sitting on chairs? Like, why have they decided to sit on chairs and discuss things, right? And it's a silly thing to say, but it's a construct, right? We've decided that we're all going to sit round. This podcast, for example, is something that we've decided is a constructive thing, a useful thing, and I wouldn't challenge it personally. But the mind of the child is to just the why, isn't it? The never-ending why.
Absolutely.
And not
we have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, the what's approach would be like, it just is, right? I saw a quote not a quote, but a discussion on a Jungian page recently. Somebody said, what is the answer to why? And a lot of people just said, because. Right? Because they are a match for each other. Just the words why and because. Because if you want to complicate things, then you can. But likewise, if you decide that you're more interested in simplicity, then it doesn't need to be discussed, right? But discourse is important, right? So we can't just say why, because
we hit
it's not constructive, is it?
Yeah, we hit philosophical bedrock or rock bottom, right? And at some point it's kind of just... Yeah, you need to start somewhere and bootstrap yourself, and surely fundamental axioms of dialogue and kind of just coherence and being able to communicate with each other is sufficient, I think, to get some sort of dialogue going, and then you can start disagreeing at a more deep level, right? Otherwise, we just don't have language even, right? You have to take something as given. Youssef, you wanted to say something about the why, perhaps, or were you... Were you referencing
I think we should. I think we'd go on a very long tangent there. So I think just to pick up from where you were going, and then
So maybe just the ego ideal. You were saying something about that, Joshua. I'm sorry, I cut you off there, but I wanted to make clear that the terms we were using were kind of standard psychoanalysis language as well. Yeah.
I mean, just like in philosophical discourse, things do tend to go on interesting tangents, and that's the thing, right? It's a beautiful thing, but at the same time, I feel like a dissatisfaction because there's so much I want to say at the same time. But anyway, the ego ideal. I mean, it's essentially what you think you should be, right? So the ego ideal, it can attach to a father figure, a mother figure, an authority figure. It can be God. It could be anything, really. And one thing that I've been thinking about recently is, what is your God, right? And God, from an Eastern point of view, is not an egocentric thing. And I use ego in the common use, such as, self-importance. If people say, I am God in the East, then perhaps, this is Alan Watts, by the way, they might say, okay, good for you. I'm glad that you've realized that you are God. You are a manifestation of God. You are God's eyes in the universe. You are an extension of the universe, right? But in the West, if you say, I am God, people will say, who do you think you are?
Yeah, it's blasphemy.
Right?
Right? Sometimes,
Yeah, sometimes. And the ego ideal, it just seems like, for example, the simple phrase, I'd rather be fishing, is a very kind of common, to say fishing is your God is a bit strange to say, right? But the God of any individual, in my opinion, is what they want to do at that time, right? And when your God becomes something that is a fabrication, like Dan Bilzerian's perceived Playboy lifestyle, I mean, my kind of casual opinion is that, it's a win-win for him and the girls and the guns and everything. It's a money machine, isn't it? The more that he can show you that you can't see on a daily basis, the more he gets views and the more he seems cool. I mean, I'm kind of over it. Because self-improvement as well, and gurus too. one of the difficulties in discussion is obviously misunderstanding. And one of the misunderstandings that is exploited by influencers is obviously omission. Like, they omit the bits of their lives that are banal, that are boring, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? To have a cup of tea, make a nice cup of tea, you might say, well, what about it? But there's a satisfaction to be gained in that. You don't need to fly a jet, right? A jet is a very abstract thing that, as you say, our ancestors would say, what the heck is that?
It's magic.
Metal bird? Right? And the strange world that gets stranger further from our roots. The roll of the dice, I think I'd rather be rolled a couple thousand years ago, to be honest. I'm becoming a bit of a Luddite, as they would say in the UK, where the group of people who would smash up new machinery because they lost their jobs to the machinery, right? Kind of a derogatory thing, Luddite-ness. I suppose you could. There are like lovely communities, like small communities that still exist. I hear good things about like Amish communities that have like very tight-knit, basic living, right?
Minimalism,
a lot of,
right?
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
become a movement, even.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like digital minimalism, and people. I know that there's cultures of travel where people say, "I don't want a lot of possessions." Yeah, there's just so much that we're told is the goal or the ego ideal, right? The ego ideal is formed, I suppose.
By our current circumstance, I think. Yeah, it's formed by our circumstance to a significant degree, right? What particular ideal we happen to adopt, right? It's kind of an interaction between the fundamental ideals that are archetypal, but also it is manifest specifically in, I don't know, in this case, a capitalist framework, right? Where Dan Bilzerian seems like the thing to be in a capitalist world to kind of transcend capitalism itself, right? Or at least you want to be free enough of capitalism by accumulating some sort of wealth to allow you to say whatever you want, to do whatever you want, that kind of thing, right? But yeah, I don't know how much more you want to linger on that particular point, but there we might want to cover a bit more into psychoanalysis and perhaps Jungian archetypes like the shadow. I was wondering,
sure.
Maybe if you disagreed with my particular invocation of the definition that I've kind of developed through a reading, you might want to define it a bit differently, have your qualms with it. But in general, well, how do you see the Jungian shadow? How do you see archetypes? And do you think they are useful and relevant concepts to discuss today?
Yeah, Jungian analytical psychology is a very difficult. I don't mean to say that it's all difficult, but language and definition of concepts is a bit of a problem in the Jungian arena because of the fact that it can become very abstract. So, for example, going into my course learning about Carl Gustav Jung, it painted the shadow as a very, very big archetype, almost like, because obviously we like to use diagrams sometimes to look at things, and there are many, many different diagrams of Jung's psyche, because there's the self, the ego, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious, right? So I'll go from collective unconscious. Yeah, sure. Archetypes and complexes. Archetypes sit in the collective unconscious, and the idea is that archetypes are not you. By definition, they are potentially aspects that can manifest within a human, right? So the archetype of the shadow and the anima are interesting ones because there's the anima for men and the animus for women, right? So you always have an anima.
Yeah, you always have both.
Sorry.
You always have both, right?
Yeah.
So if you're a man, then your anima is
maybe let's define what these terms.
So the anima is the masculine, and the animus is the feminine in very broad description. And technically, so
the anima.
There's the feminine reflected
in
all the there's the feminine reflected in the male, and there's the masculine reflected in the female. Which is to say,
so which one is which? right? So I think the animus
male
is
and
the
animus.
is the unconscious masculine side of a woman, and the anima is the unconscious feminine side of a man, right? I mean, this is just this one is taken out of Wikipedia. I was just
I'm going to go with Ahmed's definition. But the thing is, as well, it is confusing because, of course, the anima is present in the man, right? So there's a lot of kind of crossing over of concepts here, which is why it is very confusing. And obviously now, in modern discourse, when it comes to gender, people could say, and this is reflected in some neuropsychoanalysis, which is neuroscience approach, the idea that the sexual maturation of the body, the brain, and obviously the genitals and chromosomes are sometimes separate. So you could have a female with a masculine brain who does have an anima. Right. So this is very
I mean, there
because,
I think the discussion is also about whether these things are independent or as tightly. I mean, people imagine that these things must be perfectly correlated or else they're completely independent. But those are not the only two options in general, right?
And also perhaps away from the the absolute biological explanation would be just to think about them as Jordan Peterson would call them, like as disembodied spirits.
Okay.
And by spirits, there's nothing metaphysical here. Okay.
That's just important.
Which is in the sense that
what is a spirit
across
for you?
So a spirit is a pattern of behavior. Well, just a spirit in the context of human culture is a pattern of behavior. It can be transmitted through many things, right? It can be transmitted through.
It's like
story.
a meme.
It can be transmitted. It's a meme. It's definitely a meme. Yeah. So males have. I mean, if we go back in time, males had to adopt certain roles in society, and through the pattern of these roles, you can abstract, as Peterson would say, a spirit. Right? You can abstract a pattern of behavior. So that pattern of behavior would be a masculine pattern of behavior. But there isn't a single person who is solely masculine, right? And that's not actually even asked for. I mean, that's just my idea, that we should think about the feminine, the masculine, rather than just being this direct transmission between biology and how you feel or your mind or how you function. It's rather like a spirit. It's rather a structure, and this structure, I would even argue, has less to do with biology and more to do with the structure of culture and of, if I may, like, well, I'll be going too deep, but yeah, that's of culture. That would be my point.
Yeah, and I think with because obviously there is, as I said before, there is a lot of misappropriation with psychoanalysis. And to bring back our friend Goodwill Hunting, I think in modern discourse, people are being told that there are these things, right? There's an animus and an anima, for example, feminine men and masculine women, right? So that's almost like a common acknowledgement of the anima and animus. However, is there really an understanding, right? So if we start to use the terms, all of to do with the orientations and the sexualities, if we use all of these terms, do we actually come closer to understanding these aspects of ourselves? I do believe that there is value to be found. Go on, sorry.
No, you can go on. It's fine.
Yeah. So if we can liberate if somebody wants to express their anima as a man, and they want to express perceived feminine traits, then the modern discourse of freedom regarding that can help somebody come closer to what Jung would say, integrate their anima or animus. And there is a key distinction I want to make here, which is there is a difference between like the homogenization and the integration, right? So the homogenization, obviously, we're jamming everything together just because, right? So whether it's diversity in gender or race or culture, if we homogenize it all, it's kind of like throwing it all together, right? But that's not necessarily the goal. We want the beauty of each to be integrated. which is the utopia, right? We want to learn more about ourselves and others by integrating culture, not just kind of throwing it in and saying it's there, right? So for example, Jung would say about the shadow and the animus. Let's just say anima for a man. So let's talk about a man. So if he denies his anima, if he refuses to acknowledge that he has the potential to be effeminate, if he is in denial, then he may push himself further, like a pendulum. He will push himself further up in the other direction, right? And the problem is he has now the potential to swing, or have an almighty swing back. And it's not necessarily healthy to push yourself away from your potential to do all things, right? Like a Ferrari, it can go real fast, right? But it has a lot of complex parts, highly engineered, that can break down. And breakdown is really... I mean, I've experienced breakdown in the past, and Jung would call it a midlife crisis, and it causes one to reflect, right? But that's not really the goal, right? Yeah, I mean, is there anything either of you have to say about that? Because I'm kind of running on kind of tangents.
No, that's absolutely fine. So Youssef, you want to come in?
So I'd say one of the psychoanalytic fundamental points is that whatever you suppress comes back to bite you in your ass. Let's say, let's just put it that way. And no, absolutely, I can see that with the anima. I can see that with the shadow, right? So your people who do not want to deal with their shadow, let's just put the shadow as your dark side, as your capacity to do bad. Okay, are people who are usually people who, when they break down when they break down, as you have said, are mostly attacked by their demons, mostly attacked by that which they. Mostly attacked by all the bad parts in themselves that they refuse to confront. Yeah, so whatever suppresses comes back stronger. And I absolutely agree with that. I believe maybe that's why mostly all archetypes exist in like a duality. They all exist where you can go upwards and you can go downwards. And the best way is to situate yourself in the middle, which is mostly seen through, in my opinion, Joseph Campbell talks about this a lot. He's really kind of who coined the whole hero mythology, thing. In which there's a cycle in which, so when you read any piece of literature, when you watch a movie, kind of something that is epic, something that is usually fantasy and whatnot, you're not really looking at character. You're looking at characters of psyche battling together for the hero to first of all integrate his shadow. We see that with Naruto. I don't know if you know Naruto. And you see that...
Sure. Yeah, I've seen. Yeah.
Naruto. So Naruto is an anime, and he's born... Within him, he is born with a nine-tailed fox. And the nine-tailed fox is one of the strongest beasts on Earth. And everyone refuses to be his friends when he was young because they acknowledge that he has that inside him. And as Naruto grows up, he has this... dismissive personality, even he dismisses the evil that's within him. So as he moves on, he tries to integrate the shadow. So first of all, the fox that's inside him is trying to break out of him, and people have to seal it inside, and other people have to do it, right? It's kind of other people's responsibility. But then they arrive to this conclusion that it has to be his responsibility. So they ask him to go inside himself and battle himself, or try to integrate your shadow by whatever means you can. Then he battles him and he wins, but then forward he becomes friends with him. He integrates him. And he can use the good that the shadow offers him. So I believe that this can apply to whatever characters you have within your own psyche. So that would be the anima, that would be the shadow, whatever Jungian archetypes, whatever Jungian, overshadowing archetypes.
Youssef, you had some points about the self as well, I think, which might be interesting. It's another archetype, and I don't know if Josh, are you familiar with the self, the archetype of the self?
Yeah. I mean, it's part of Jung's model of the psyche.
Is that anything? Any interesting thoughts on that? I mean, do you have any? I mean, maybe define it first. And
it's most interesting, really. Yeah. So the self is at once the fool and the king, right? That's the whole idea.
Okay.
which is
So
the self
define.
is the self is your potential. And you see the self in literature as usually a wise man who is goofy at the same time. You know, you see this like I don't know, Dumbledore, Jiraiya, Yoda. It's this character that dies before the hero has
Maturity.
to deal with maturity, or has to deal with the shadow. So the self dies, or exactly the moment when the hero understands his potential and his highest value, or understands exactly what he has to do to integrate the shadow. So that's usually how it goes, right? So so a hero has to go on a quest, and there is a wise man that has taught him everything and has given him, these vague quotes in which there's this really interesting scene. Have you watched Avatar: The Last Airbender? Not to bring any kids show here.
I have not personally, no.
Okay, so there's this character, just not to go too long on that, but there's this character called Zuko, and Zuko, his uncle, is really playing the self in the series, or some form of that. He's this old wise man that always says these really things that sound very wise, but really like they don't really mean anything.
Vague platitudes that mean nothing.
Platitudes, yeah.
Platitudes,
Yeah.
And then there's this scene where it all makes sense to Zuko at one point. And it only makes sense to him when his uncle's called Iroh, goes away and doesn't want to talk to him, and is kind of really non-existent in his path anymore. And then there's the scene where he tries to imitate his self. He tries to imitate his uncle. So Zuko stands up and talks to a rock as if the rock is Zuko and he is his uncle. And he goes and then he just keeps uttering platitudes.
Nonsense.
But it's technically nonsense. It's even nonsense to him. So that's the self, really. It's at once the fool, it's the king, it's all your potential. And technically, well, how Joseph Campbell would even put it, it's that the self kind of actualizes into the hero before the hero has to deal with evil, or has to deal with the ultimate evil at the end.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to, when it comes, so this is the problem with Jungian psychology, right? The self, I mean, I've had defined to me the wise old man archetype, and it's so complicated because, of course, you have manifestations within yourself, and then your perceived archetypes in others, right? So one could perceive, Zuko could perceive his uncle Iroh as wise or a fool, right? And also he could take, as a result, he could perhaps feel that he is the fool if he is in front of the wise, or vice versa. Right, it depends on the pride in the individual, I suppose. I mean, usually within the kind of diagrammatic kind of representation, the self is it encloses the ego, right? And I suppose you would be correct to say it could be your perceived goal, or perhaps you don't really know what the goal is, or kind of differentiation from the self and the ego. And I believe that the goal of the individuation, which is kind of like the final goal for enlightenment, if you like, although Jung never really used that word, is to be ego free from, he says, the trappings of life, right? So to be your true self, and that is quite a trope, isn't it, in media? Just be yourself, right? So it's not that his uncle is trying to push things on him, right? But maybe to understand things within himself, which may have slightly different meaning, right? Absolutely. So these platitudes that his uncle is saying, they mean a lot to him, right? And maybe he's having fun by saying, saying the things knowing that his nephew is kind of not going to get them. He's maybe playing the jester.
No, absolutely. He is playing the jester. And he's a very like comical character, right? He's lazy. He wants to drink tea and just, go on boat rides. So Zuko does not take him carefully. It does not take him seriously. That's the whole point. He only takes him seriously when he has to, well, when
the going gets tough, and when the going gets tough, when Zuko's pride becomes something that he's trying to get rid of at some point. So Zuko is trying to kind of transcend his ego at certain points, and he actually instrumentalizes then all those platitudes to help him find the way.
Yeah, he's even direct about that at some. I don't know what we're talking about Avatar that much, but he's even, but he's even very direct about that. He always tells him that he wants him to be himself, right? He always says that he tells him that he should not identify with what his father wants. That's the message
archetype.
Of
Don't identify with the archetype too strongly. Right, you should try to embody it, more specifically to your circumstance. And I think this is where I'd ask you guys to kind of elaborate on how does your view of archetypes more broadly fit into maybe an understanding of us as evolved creatures? Like, what is the use of these seemingly very deep ideas and patterns of behavior? Have you thought much about that, Josh?
I think basically they are our limitations in a way, because they're like the anchor that keep us in the Homo sapien arena. I mean, for example, in, let's say, Star Trek, the aliens, right, they've tried to make the aliens look same but different, and people say, why do they look like humans, right? And the answer is, when they try and make them too different, we can't identify with them. So if you have literal big insects that have no human faces, right, we don't identify with those because we just don't know what we're looking at, really. So the archetype is kind of what keeps us in the realm of, recognizing, I mean, archetypal figures within, say, the clan or the tribe, right? The elder, the mother, the warrior, protector, and so on. The archetypes are there to stay because they've served us well in the past to recognize. And Jung is at odds with John Locke's theory of tabula rasa, the blank slate, and that's why I think we see themes come back again and again. Like, for example, when I mentioned Freud, I also mentioned Plato, because I believe Plato had a metaphor for two horses, being the id and the superego. Yeah. And one, they're going in different directions, right? Plato, came up with this, years and years ago, but it's still true, right? Because we are humans, and as a result, the archetypes remain.
His was a bit more about, like, it was separated a bit differently, but yeah, I mean, the appetite, spirit, and reason was more the kind of theory of the soul in Plato's ideas, right? And his idea was that reason was kind of the supreme arbiter. Really, I mean, you wanted them all to work in tandem, but reason was the supreme part that was able to keep the others in check, but often failed to some degree, right? So it was basically the analog of the super ego in a way, right?
Just vaguely.
Appetite would be closer fit, I guess, to the id. Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, and they're kind of variations on a theme, right? Because theory of mind was something that Freud kind of put together. I mean, I believe it was illustrated to me that basically before, the theory of mind, I know some the name escapes me. Obviously, the focus was, on the body, on the heart, and then it moved to the mind, right, with Freud. Name escapes me. But kind of going back to the archetypes, I mean, another thing that I think we want to bring into the conversation is also personas, because they are also kind of another complicating factor, right? The personas we put on can resemble archetypes, right? But they are not who we are, as well. That's another problem with analytical psychology of Jung. It's very difficult to hone in unless you are actually face to face with a person, right? In an analytical setting. I mean, I do like Joseph Campbell and his analysis of stories, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and the monomyth, right?
Yeah.
You cannot deny that the tropes come back again and again, and for us to identify with a story, it needs to have these things. For example, if I told you a story, I went to the shop, I bought some pancakes, I went home. You would say, okay, why have you told me this story? Because it doesn't fit the archetype. Any archetype of a story, right? It's useless information, or an incomplete story, right? You think that's odd, that's not what I want in a story. And as a result, like, what we recognize and are drawn to will be found in archetypes, right? I would love to be drawn to all the good things that are good for me in life, like exercise, reading for hours, having brilliant discussions, but that, I'm still drawn to some pretty primitive stuff, right? Addictive behaviors. And the archetypes, like, I don't know. I mean, they're part of the collective unconscious, just to be clear, right? The idea is that we are not archetypes, right? The archetypes are broadly what humans are capable of, the roles they're capable of fulfilling. But the idea is to say, hang on a second, that's not me, right? To become yourself in the face of the archetypes, and also the personas, right? The personas that we put on in everyday situations, in a pragmatic way, right? They are useful, but moving towards a society where we can be more true to ourselves, is the goal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, it's crucial to see that these archetypes are abstractions from our historical circumstances, really, right? I mean, we could see certain patterns of behavior across time that were somewhat correlated, or patterns of behavior or ideas. And we were able to abstract those behaviors and put them in kind of a single package. And that is what an archetype is, right, in a way. And we need not believe that any of these were necessarily all manifest at once, just that aspects of them were manifest at certain times and that we were able to abstract them from that. And I think, the crucial thing about not identifying too strongly with the archetype, not attempting to become a caricature, really. Do not become a caricature. I mean, some people, you see some people and the way they try to present themselves. I mean, to some degree, I do this in tongue-in-cheek. On Facebook, I try to present myself as this extreme narcissist, right? But it is meant to be tongue-in-cheek. To identify too much with a particular archetype, to be a cartoon kind of character, is potentially dangerous, right? Because then you get the response to that is usually a swing back, as Youssef and you put. Yeah, Youssef, did you want to come in here and say something?
Yeah, so
we're concluding at this point.
Well, identifying too much with an archetype is almost it's too similar to identifying with, let's say, an ideology, right? So, which is something I actually wanted to touch on, which is possession of ideas. I mean, what do you think about that from like a psychoanalytic perspective? So for you to find, for one to find oneself, one must not identify with an archetype fully. That just would be, like that would just logically follow, I guess. And
more commonly, I mean, it's more common to say persona, right? To identify with a persona as well, because we're focusing a lot on archetypes, but personas are, because the difference, in my opinion, between Jungian and Freudian psychoanalysis is that Jung is looking at the present, right? He doesn't necessarily consider the past to be of such significance, because he thinks that we have the potential to move forward, right? So the archetype is the legend, I suppose, and the persona is the mask we put on, maybe, to resemble the archetype, right? And the idea that this mask can stick to our face, I mean, this is my metaphor, but if we wear the mask too often, it can just meld into who we are,
you become the
archetype.
Further. So if you identify too much with the persona, you become the archetype, which is, I mean...
It's further from individuation, basically. And of course, it breaks down discourse, because we are somebody with a persona communicating with somebody with a persona. We're so many layers away from honest discourse, right? We're just kind of doing this dance that doesn't mean anything, right? And it becomes abstract.
Yeah, it becomes difficult to understand and even grapple with the person you were talking to, because instead you're dealing with the idea. I mean, this is the common encounter of meeting someone who is ideologically possessed. Right, you're not listening to the person. I mean, you're talking to someone who's ideologically possessed, and this is something Jordan Peterson says, when within 2 sentences of what the person is about to say, you can pretty much predict exactly what they will finish with, right? And I mean, people sometimes judge me for jumping to conclusions about what people are going to say and trying to respond to what they're going to say before hearing them fully out. But usually when I do that, it's because I truly do think I've heard exactly what you're about to say a number of times. And it's not because you have boring ideas, it's because the ideas are not yours, right? And you can tell the difference, right? If the idea is not the person's, it doesn't actually matter who you're talking to. Like, to some degree, it kind of vanishes from my mind who I'm talking to. It doesn't really matter. Now I'm just pretty much responding by invoking basically a past record tape of what I said to the other person and just repeating it, right? And so it doesn't actually matter. And it's counterproductive, right? You can tell when someone is not is just playing a game, and they're not actually being honest about what ideas are theirs, or they haven't actually mastered the ideas in any sense that makes it theirs, right? It's just the same tired lines.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean,
I'll tell you, there is a difficulty actually that's kind of brought to me, and that's in the academic environments. I think there's a fear of developing your own ideas, especially within sciences and to some extent within the arts, because obviously you start off as a speck, a crumb in the university, and it's like, who are you? What value do your ideas have, right? So you start to build on and basically just take ideas, reference them, cite them, and then you get a good grade if you show an understanding, right? And then as you move through academia, you have to show that you develop original ideas. And I suppose within social media and so on, you can immediately express whatever you want, right? As a kind of like a strange kind of antidote to the academic environment, because I think that university environments can become difficult for free speech. And obviously the persona thing as well, like if we're just regurgitating ideas non-stop, and that's kind of where I wanted to kind of finish the thought on the regurgitating ideas. Oh gosh, it's escaped me.
The archetype?
It's the fact that we think we're enlightened, the fact that we can regurgitate more interesting ideas, but we didn't come up with them, right? So we're merely pushing a button to say, look, here's this thing, this meme, it's mimetic.
It's resonant.
It's right. It's not. Yeah, and obviously people who resonate with that will I would say punt it, like as in a bad football kick, right? Just punt it down the road and say, look at this, I agree with this vaguely, and then it gets echoed, and the resonance continues, right? So academic environments are difficult in another way, because you feel maybe that if you come up with an original idea, somebody somewhere may have had it. It may be plagiarism or so on, like the boogeyman of plagiarism. And the idea that if you come up with an original idea, you have to thoroughly back it up somehow, even though it's an original idea, with something that's come before. My experience is that my original-ish ideas have been met with positive reception, but I know in some environments it's difficult to actually, the original thought is not necessarily. I mean, I believe that officially it's always expected, because that's how you get the distinction. The distinction in the UK system. But I think that it's miscommunicated.
Yeah,
in a way.
I think just to put my last points, and then maybe Youssef can conclude. And if you want to say something, Josh, feel free. But yeah, I think there is a trade-off really between building up some barriers to entry so as to enforce some form of rigorous screening for the quality of ideas, which is kind of what universities are attempting to do. They want to kind of screen out, people who are just there to blurt out whatever pseudoscience or not even pseudoscience, right? Sometimes it's not even pseudoscience what they're blurting out. And so you want to screen against that, but to screen against that, you need to implement some sort of standard. And if you're implementing a standard, it is sometimes hard to judge the quality of truly novel ideas by an old standard, because they simply don't fit that standard. They're just a different species. And so I think the problem that we're trying to figure out is really, what are the minimum standards required to keep all the crackpots out while maintaining some level of ingenuity and creativity and a culture of that within the university environment, which we sadly are losing, right? And I'm actually agnostic about whether it's possible at all to do that. I think to some degree you're going to have to allow the crackpots to come in, right? And let them play the game and potentially even lose the game, but not necessarily be kicked out of the game completely. I think you're gonna require people to take a different approach to education and allow them to come in, allow those crackpots to come in, because I think those same crackpots are potentially people who are able to contribute very novel and radical ideas, right? They're highly agentic. So I don't think it's an easy classification problem at all in that sense. But yeah, Youssef, you wanna, or Josh, whichever. Yeah.
If you
want
to add anything, Josh.
I think, yeah, sure. I mean, I think the linchpin is free speech, right? We've spoken a bit about repression and expression. And unfortunately, if we move into a climate of being policed for our speech, then more is going to be repressed. There was something I saw that happened a year ago with the actor Liam Neeson. He said that after something bad had happened in his life, he had prejudice against people, black people, he said. He said that for a week he felt murderous towards black people just for the colour of their skin. And he said that he didn't do anything about it, but after a week he realised he was being unreasonable, right? So he thought, okay, I need to think about this more and then reflect. And then he said at the end of it that nothing bad happened and he actually gained a greater understanding of himself. And he said, you know what, I don't want to be racist based on colour of skin. Regardless of what's happened, it's not right. Okay, and he came clean about this about a year ago. But it was blown up in the media, and they said he had murderous intent towards someone of a different race. And that the bit that they omitted was that he realised something, and he actually cleansed himself of prejudice as a result. And I believe that is a great example of how free speech is important, and also the peeling away of the persona and the archetype, because then we can have the honest discussion without fear. And without that fear, we'll have less repression of, sometimes problematic things, sometimes beautiful things that may actually be appreciated, right? The free speech is so important, and I really hope that we don't see too much policing of speech so that we can understand each other, talk about things that are controversial, like we have here, which I obviously really appreciate. And without, because we need to talk and have the discussion, don't we? Otherwise, it may fester within yourself and manifest as who knows, kind of what.
Yeah. I mean, thank you very much, Josh, by the way, for coming. And yeah, Youssef, you go ahead.
Of course. If I may just so I absolutely agree. And I actually, I really wish we could move forward where we could reintroduce this especially concerns me, which is the idea of the feminine and the masculine. I wish we could reintroduce it into a mainstream conversation, and especially that now that the masculine and the feminine has been somehow only reserved and reduced to the aesthetic, which is something I find troubling. And I mean, you're absolutely correct. We need to. I mean, especially coming from me and Ahmed, we do understand the value of free speech. We do understand the value of free speech, especially in conversations like that. Yeah. So, thank you, Josh.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and you have an open invitation to join us again, and we'll definitely arrange more conversations. It's been very insightful, and thank you, man. Thank you for coming. It's been great, Josh.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I feel the fool for all that I've said, but no. It hasn't been too.
Not at all. I think our imposter today is mild by comparison of many other imposters, to quote the great Hitchens.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Oh, yes, miss him.
Yeah. And on that note, I think we can end. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you for tuning in. Care. All right. I'll see you.
Goodbye.
Bye.